I want to tell you a story about a troubled kid. But unlike so many stories that involve juvenile delinquency, this one has a happy ending because this kid grows up to be arguably the greatest composer that America ever produced. The boy's name was George Gershwin, and his story is an intriguing one because he was raised in a home that was almost completely without music. He was born in 1898 in New York City, the son of immigrant parents who struggled just to put food on the table. George was an enormous behavioral problem as a youngster. He stole food from push carts, he regularly engaged in fist fights, he vandalized property, he set fires. He lost his virginity, he had sex with a girl at age 9. He was a terrible student, inattentive, disruptive, couldn't sit still in the classroom. Now, his older brother, Ira, was George's temperamental opposite. Ira was courteous, soft-spoken, an excellent student. And whenever teachers sent home notes complaining about George's school performance, Ira intercepted them and assured the authorities that George would do better the next time. It is difficult to do retrospective psychiatric diagnoses on historical figures. I have enough trouble getting a diagnosis right with the living, breathing patients that I see in my office. But I am convinced that a modern-day psychiatrist examining the young George Gershwin would give him a diagnosis of conduct disorder, probably additionally diagnose him with attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, or ADHD, and might start him on a psychostimulant medication like Adderall or Ritalin. Now, these medications didn't exist during Gershwin's lifetime, but he still made a remarkable recovery. One day at school, a classmate of his named Maxie Rosen gave a violin recital. True to form, George was outside in the schoolyard playing hooky. But apparently the window for the school assembly opened out into the courtyard. And as soon as George heard the first notes of this concert, he was so transfixed by the sounds of the violin that he decided on the spot he was going to devote his life to the study of music. So he befriends this kid Maxie, he persuades his parents to let him take piano lessons. And once he starts, all the bad behavior, the fistfights, the stealing, that all stops. It was as if his young brain had been some boiling, bubbling cauldron of disorganized, disruptive noise, waiting for some outside force to impose order. And that outside force turned out to be music. All right, he drops out of school at age 15, forms a successful songwriting team with his brother Ira writing the lyrics. The dynamics established between the two of them as youngsters persisted for the rest of their lives together. Ira's the responsible older brother, serving as a stabilizing force for his brilliant, hyperkinetic, and sometimes thoroughly disorganized younger brother. All right, January 1924. The 25-year-old George Gershwin is putting the finishing touches on the musical Sweet Little Devil, which will have a tryout in Boston before opening on Broadway. Ira's reading the morning newspaper, the New York Tribune, sees an article about an elaborate upcoming concert organized by jazz band leader Paul Whiteman, entitled An Experiment in Modern Music. What catches Ira's attention is a sentence which reads, "Among the works to be performed will be a jazz concerto by George Gershwin." Ira shows the article to his brother. George has a vague recollection of what he thought was an informal conversation with Whiteman a year earlier. He had no idea that he had made a commitment to compose a piece. The concert is 1 month away. Needless to say, he has not written a single note. But rather than panicking, he decides this would be a good opportunity to try something unprecedented. He's going to write a large-scale work that combines elements of jazz, pop, and classical music. And these were genres that were considered to be distinct. The next day, he has to travel up to Boston by railroad. As he listens to the sounds of the train, the whoosh of the steam engine, the clickety-clack of the train along the tracks. As he listens to these sounds, virtually the entire construction of Rhapsody in Blue reveals itself to him. He had throughout his life a remarkable ability to extract music out of what others would have considered to be merely noise. Years later, he takes a trip to Paris. He notices that the Parisian taxi horns sound different from the taxi horns he's accustomed to hearing in New York City. Before he leaves France, he goes to an auto parts store, comes back to America with 4 authentic Parisian taxi horns. Nowadays, anytime any orchestra anywhere in the world plays that Gershwin symphonic masterpiece, An American in Paris, you hear those taxi horns. He incorporated them into the score. All right, let's get back on that train to Boston. Gershwin hears almost all of Rhapsody in Blue in his head, but he says there's one theme that he just can't access. He says, it's haunting me on the inside. As soon as he gets to a piano, he says the following just oozes out of his fingers. Rhapsody in Blue got an ecstatic reception from the first audience that heard it in February of 1924. But the music critics were much less enthusiastic. The critical consensus was that Gershwin was a talented young composer, but he was insufficiently trained, and the piece structurally was a mess. He looked to address this perceived deficiency by contacting Igor Stravinsky, who at the time was probably the most esteemed composer in the classical music world. Gershwin asked Stravinsky if he could study with him, and then said, "By the way, how much do you charge for lessons?" And Stravinsky responded, "That depends. How much do you earn?" And Gershwin told him what he had earned in the previous year. Stravinsky said, "I would like to study with you." Stravinsky was always struck by Gershwin's excess of nervous energy. The hyperactivity that characterized him as a youngster persisted for the rest of his life. You could hear it in his music. This, for example, from Rhapsody in Blue. Tell me, could that have been written by somebody who was not hyperactive? Do you know this Gershwin song? When Gershwin would play that song, it would sound more like this. People asked him, "Why do you play everything that way?" He answered, "We live in an age of staccato, not legato." Now, staccato is a musical term which refers to clipped, abrupt, detached playing as opposed to legato, which is smooth and connected. I mean, this was the jazz age, it was the roaring 20s. But I think Gershwin lived in a central nervous system of staccato and not of legato. Now, even with the hyperactivity, the adult Gershwin would not have received an ADHD diagnosis if he had that hypothetical visit with a 21st century psychiatrist. As a grown up, he had an excellent attention span. He was no longer prone to impulsive behavior. And unlike so many conduct disorder children, he didn't have any antisocial or sociopathic tendencies as an adult. George Gershwin's life was completely transformed by his exposure to music as a youngster. Music didn't just cure him, it made him better than well by unlocking the creative genius within. His story is not unique. I could present cases of many other individuals with a range of intractable psychological and medical problems that only music could reach. The notion that music can heal is not a recent revelation. The ancient Greeks designated Apollo as the god of both medicine and music. And in many primitive cultures, the roles of physician and musician were played by the same person. I mean, the shamans would sometimes use medical instruments. Sometimes they'd use musical instruments like a flute, a drum, or a harp. They didn't make a distinction because their only purpose was to heal. We live in more specialized times, and medicine and music are regarded nowadays as separate domains. Something has probably been gained by this increase in specialization, but my concern is that much has been lost. And as medicine becomes more pharmacologically and technologically driven, it is essential for those of us in the healthcare professions to recognize music's extraordinary capacity to reduce pain, to soothe anxiety, to lift spirits. Let's contemplate this as we immerse ourselves in the glorious world of George Gershwin's imagination.